Hello, Innovation Stream friends. Wherever you are in the world, I hope you and your loved ones are healthy and safe. My name is Randy Bell, and I'm the director of the Global Energy Center at the Atlantic Council. Thank you all for joining us today for EnergySource Innovation Stream, where we highlight new energy technologies with the potential to reshape the global energy system. Today, we will be hearing from TJ Kirk, Manager for Oil and Gas Solutions at the Rocky Mountain Institute, who will discuss how RMI's new emissions data platform called the Climate Action Engine enables operators, investors, regulators, and the public to take action towards reducing methane gas emissions. Before we get started, we have a quick poll and 2 administrative details. So Jackson, let's start the poll. Today, we'd like to get your thoughts on what the greatest challenges of measuring and verifying methane emissions. So you see the options up there. So I'll go through the administrative details while you fill out the poll. We will share the results after TJ's presentation. So first administrative detail, you can follow us on Twitter at AC Global Energy and use the hashtag InnovationStream. And then second, after TJ's presentation, you can submit questions through the Q&A function on Zoom, and I'll try to get to as many of these as I can. If you're watching on another platform like YouTube, unfortunately, we cannot take your questions. Okay, we're going to close the poll now. Thank you to all who participated, and back to the program. Please let me welcome TJ to the Atlantic Council. TJ, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Randy, and happy to be here. Hello, everyone. My name is TJ Kirk, and like Randy said, I'm a manager at Rocky Mountain Institute. And today I'll be sharing what we've been working on with the Climate Action Engine and some techniques for tracking and managing methane emissions. So we'll do a quick presentation, just a couple of slides, and then I'm actually going to show a live demo of the platform as it is right now in its beta version. So why methane? Why are we focusing on methane at all? Well, methane is an extremely powerful greenhouse gas. On a 20-year time frame, it's about 84 times more powerful than CO2 in terms of its warming potential. And that is a really big deal for us. It comes from a variety of sources, including livestock, agriculture, live rice fields, as well as rice paddies, wetlands, and landfills. But a big chunk of that also comes from oil and gas production. And unlike the others, oil and gas production is a very concentrated area where you can really find some of these point source areas, as well as understand what infrastructure might be leaking or venting methane into the atmosphere. So we've decided to really concentrate our efforts in that space. There's around 80 million metric tons of methane per year that are leaked globally. Around a significant chunk of that comes from the US itself. And we believe that if we can get the oil and gas producers to lower their methane intensity to around 0.05%, which is pretty achievable with best practices, that alone will reduce around 1.5 million metric tons of methane, or equivalent to about 32 coal-fired power plants every year from our atmosphere. So that is the prize that we're targeting. How do we actually want to go and do that? Well, we want to be able to answer 2 fairly simple questions. Where are emissions happening, and who are the best performers? And we want to do this to enable decision makers to answer a variety of different questions. And the stakeholders and decision makers we're really focusing on right now are the producers, the buyers, the financiers, investors, the regulators, and the general public. And what we're acknowledging is that each of these groups has really different questions they want to be able to answer. So for operators, it's, how can they make operational improvements, and what are the risks to their business that they might face from oil and gas, regulations, or from the physical impacts of climate change. Investors, for example, want to lower the risk of their portfolio, while regulators might want to start to see, how do these reported methane emissions assessments from the companies match up against what's being measured by satellites or other, aerial sensors. So we're hoping that we can answer all these different questions within this platform that we're calling the Climate Action Engine. And then finally, we're also developing a low methane certified gas standard. And the purpose of this is to allow producers that are, have a lower methane intensity to get rewarded for that. And it kind of fits somewhere in between just voluntary company action. We've seen a lot of these larger IOCs start to make announcements of moving towards, net zero by 2050. And then we have a body of regulatory policy frameworks across the globe, but we still don't have just one way for buyers, especially, to be able to buy gas confidently, knowing that that gas is differentiated from gas on the general market. And that's where we're hoping that this methane emission standard for natural gas can really make a difference. So I've gone through a lot of different things very quickly right there, and it's going to accelerate a little bit more as we go into the actual demo itself. So a couple of upfront notes about the demo. This is our beta version. It's meant as a data explorer tool, not the end state of the actual climate action engine. And what we're doing with CAE is to bring together modeled, measured, and reported methane emissions data along with any sort of other relevant asset data. And so here you can see we have satellite sensors, we have asset data, which includes production data, ownership, and other relevant details, along with everything that's been reported to federal agencies from the companies that could be relevant for us to want to explore. So what do we actually have in this at the moment? For ESG events, we can show flaring data, spills, losses, blowouts, other things reported to the federal government. We have some flyover data from one of our partners here in Texas, as well as satellite sensor data across Texas and focused on the Permian, as well as asset data, and then floodplain mapping as well. Now, I'm going to start clicking on some of these layers to show some of the potential use cases here. But what's really important to note as well is that we're focusing on the Permian as a use case site, but our plan is to expand this nationally and then globally in the next 2 to 3 years. So the idea being that everything that is useful for the Permian is also useful for other areas as well. So what can we start to do with this kind of data when you have it in a system like this? Well, we can pull up satellite data from VEERS, which tracks flaring data. We can overlay what companies report to the EPA for how much flaring they're doing, and just simply overlay those two and start to say, okay, how do the company reportings match up against what we're detecting? And one thing that's interesting to note here is that satellites generally have a slightly higher sensitivity threshold. They're so far up, it's really hard for them to see these small events, but they can really pick up on big events, which can be pretty critical. About half of all methane emissions from oil and gas come from just 5% of leaks. So here we can see that there are some larger bubbles that aren't accounted for in the reported flaring. So while oil and gas companies report more flares than are detected, a lot of the flares that they're reporting on are these really small flares. And if we want to, we can really start to drill down. We can just pick this one as an example. If we want to, we can go down and change the base map. And then we can also overlay all of the oil and gas wells in Texas. There's a couple 100,000 of those. And we start to get a really good sense of who is probably behind this particular emission. And if we click on the dot here, it brings us up the operator information for that particular well site. This particular one is Hibernia Resources. Now, we also have to acknowledge that the placement of these circles from VEERS or from any satellite can be a little bit, suspect. It's a similar thing when you're using GPS on your phone, and your phone might be off by, call it 10 meters. These satellites can be off by, a similar margin or a little bit more. So you can't go with a regulator at this point and say, hey, we think this might be you, but you have a pretty good sense that one of these surrounding ones is most likely responsible for this particular flare. So that is one example. If we scroll back out, we can also use just the reported numbers for some pretty interesting comparisons. Methane intensity is the measure of how much natural gas or methane you lose during the production. And this is a really big deal. The common narrative is that natural gas is a cleaner or less carbon intensive fuel than coal. But if your methane intensity is around 2.5 to 3%, that puts you on par with coal. So any methane intensity higher than 2.8%, let's say, is from a global warming perspective worse than coal. So here we can see data from 2018 that's been reported to the EPA, comparing companies across the Permian just on their methane intensity. And several of these companies are significantly worse than that, 2.8% benchmark. And it also really shows you the difference between companies that can exist. Now, I also need to acknowledge that, again, we are using reported numbers for this particular calculation. Over time, we're hoping to incentivize more and more companies to use more measured data being satellites, flyovers, drones, handheld sensors, or ground-based sensors. And with measured data, you can really start to validate what you're reporting, get better numbers and get better granularity, and have a lot more trust in that data. EDF and others who have done flyovers have found consistently that the emissions data is generally higher than what is being reported, but is kind of within, the realm of possibilities here. So with our methane emissions standard, we're hoping to provide a way to reward those companies who are at a lower emissions intensity and are doing more of that measurement and have good company practices for those policies and procedures that they're enacting. And then I know we're getting quickly to the Q&A time. A couple of points on what I think makes the climate action engine really unique is that for all of these data sources that have a time component or being updated, all that data is updated automatically. Then once the data is ingested into this system, we have a ledger system that tracks any transformations or analytics that are done to that data. So you get a really strong chain of verification. So you can go back and check at any point, that this data was totally secure. And then lastly, we're also building in the functionalities to be able to add proprietary data. So again, almost all of this data is the public-facing data that anyone could have access to. It just hasn't been cleaned up or put into the same place to compare. But once you have companies, investors, or others that have their own data sources they can bring into this, it becomes a really powerful tool then for whatever use case they want to apply it to. And then the final thing I want to show right now before we get to Q&A is that we're also starting to think about not just the impacts oil and gas is having on climate, but also flipping that around to say, well, what are the impacts that climate will have on oil and gas? And the first one we're looking at is the potential impact of flooding. So using the flood risk layers and with the oil and gas assets, we can get a flood risk summary that can be a little bit slow to load sometimes. So I went ahead and tried to put it up on a separate screen as well. And here we can see how much production is at risk from flooding over a 30-year period. So assuming that a well site might be hit by a flood and then production would have to close down for that well, how much production is at risk for companies in the Permian? And these are the top 5 companies at risk for that particular threat. So I know I've gone through a lot of things, but I think I'm right at time for Q&A. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for the moment and then turn it over to Randy to moderate the Q&A.
TJ, thank you so much. That's really, really fascinating. What a fantastic effort. And we're looking forward to seeing how this gets developed beyond Texas into the rest of the country and hopefully the world. It could just be really valuable as we try to reduce methane emissions. If you're interested in asking questions from the audience, please feel free to put them in the Q&A and we'll get to as many as we can. First question from me though, the tool requires at least some cooperation with the oil and gas industry. How does that work? Particularly given that you see a divide in the industry between some of the larger companies that really want to see methane regulations and recognize the need to reduce fugitive methane and flaring, and some of the smaller companies that have been opposed to methane regulations and supported the Trump administration's rollback of methane regs.
So we've been working hand in hand with the industry to develop this. We currently have a informal user advisory board made up of some of the really large IOCs to help us, develop what are the valuable use cases for them. And even though we've had, some reluctance from, smaller companies, like you said, we've actually had some embracement from them as well, saying, hey, as a smaller company, we can pivot a lot quicker. We think our products are better. We want you to help us prove that our products are better. So we're trying to help enable that competition between companies. And then really, focusing on the iterative process here, right? That we'd like to see those regulations come back, but in the absence of those regulations, how can we continue moving forward and developing tools and standards that companies can still adopt?
Got it. Got it. Now the data becomes a big challenge. You're going to be working with a lot of data from a lot of different sources. How do you think about the data sources that you have, comparing different sources, apples to oranges, checking on their data quality, et cetera? How do you work on that?
That is $1 million question, actually probably a couple $1 million question. Over time, we hope to pull in more and more of these sources and start to develop, what are the trusted layers, quote unquote. So, there's Project Astra happening around Haynesville with BP, where they're comparing a bunch of these different sensor technologies against each other to then say, how accurate are these measurements, relative to each other. And then that would be how we can expand into what we're calling, like low trust or higher risk areas. So some basins, especially, Eastern Europe or in Asia, just simply don't have the quality of data that the Texas Railroad Commission provides. So when we go into those areas of specific knowledge, we just won't have access to as much data, but we still get that same satellite data sensors going overhead. So if we can compare the satellite sensors to the ground-based sensors and start to get a feel for how good are these things, and then understanding just the simple physical characteristics of the basin, you can really model pretty accurately what are the associated emissions.
Got it. Now we have two good follow-on questions from the audience. So first, just on the satellite data, what is the state of satellite observation of methane leaks and venting, and is that data publicly available?
So some of it is publicly available. There are quite a few sensors that are live now. GoSat and a couple others, started out and had pretty poor resolution. Right now, we have the European Strapomi satellite, which gives you a 7x7 block. And I forgot to show that one, but we have that for Texas ingested. Then Methane Sat from EDF, just received $100 million from Jeff Bezos to go ahead and launch. But I also want to emphasize that the satellites themselves really aren't a silver bullet. The resolution is generally too high to detect to like the smaller emissions. So even though you can get those large emissions that account for, let's say half of all emissions, there's going to still be a number of smaller leaks, thief hatches being open that account for a good amount of emissions that are really hard to, figure out exactly where it's happening with a satellite. So some ways around that are to do what's called a tip and cue system. So a satellite with higher resolution covers more area, finds hotspots, cues a smaller satellite with more sensitive, imaging to go and take a look, or target for a flyover or for a ground-based, survey to go and occur.
So it really requires multiple ways of monitoring to try to really get at the entirety of the problem.
Yes, the ideal system does incorporate multiple layers.
Got it. Okay, another follow-on question from Jacqueline Weaver, who asks about the Texas Railroad Commission and if they support this work or participate at all, or just even encourage the type of data collection that you're doing. I know you use some of their data, but the data that they collect, but do they support this effort?
So we developed this tool in partnership with Spherical Analytics, a great data firm, and they had to kind of go through the work of actually pulling the data sets out of the different groups. I'm not sure if Texas Railroad Commission even knows this particular tool exists with their data, but it is something we're really thankful and grateful for Railroad Commission for requesting of the companies. But I'm not aware of a formal relationship at this point.
Got it. Okay, so what do you see as the limitations to this type of platform? You can do a lot, but what sort of where do you want to draw the line and say we need different technology to farther the field?
I mean, the first limitation that jumps to mind in some ways is me, that I can't think of every great use case out there. So one of my goals is to try to open up this platform enough that other folks can come in and collaborate and build upon the same data sets to develop these new tools and analytics and find these clever insights. I'm not the smartest person in the room, but I want to help find those smart people and bring them into one place so that we can all work together.
Got it. Now, how does this tool differ from, say, the International Energy Agency's methane tracker?
Great question. It varies in that we're trying to bring in different data sources than what they have for the IEA tool, and then the analytics and insights we want to drive out of that. So while the IEA tool is really great as kind of a general purpose thing, our goal is to move this towards really specific use cases. So being able to identify, for flaring, what would be the optimal, maintenance schedule and upgrade schedule to specific pieces of equipment that would enable flaring to operate more efficiently and reduce unlit flares, for example. Or for an investor to come in and figure out for their portfolio, which companies have the highest and lowest risk based on whatever metrics they think are most useful. So really tailoring the use cases, I think, is the differentiator there.
Got it. So we have two questions from the audience that are tied together. So is this tool publicly available yet? And will it have an API?
So the tool is not publicly available at the moment. We are still, like I said, in beta development here. We are targeting a broader release, I'd say mid next year. And then we want to initially open it up to those different stakeholder audiences we've been talking about. And I also imagine a sort of tiered approach here, that we might not have an API to every single data set that we've ingested, but all of the data that comes from these public sources, we are a nonprofit. We want to make that data available to folks. So we are exploring, what are the best ways to do that? Can we host a server on our own end? Is it an API? Do we form a different nonprofit that just becomes the data steward? But yes, our goal is to make as much of the data as possible widely available.
Got it. Okay, great question coming in from Jason Bloom. It asks, how much do you sense the use of data may get more support from the Biden administration and the regulatory posture that the new administration will bring? Will regulators force more adoption based on the data and the information you are able to provide?
We are really optimistic that the Biden administration will have, more regulations for this and be more willing to kind of encourage oil and gas to go down this path. But at the same time, we never want to rely on policy as our single lever to help move the industry. So we're encouraging, oil and gas companies to start adopting like the low emission standard today, and to start adopting these technologies, as soon as possible. But understanding that some companies, don't want to be on the forefront and would be content to stay right where they are. So, we are eager to work with the Biden administration, or really any, administration, because we want to take this global. And again, we have a partner in Europe, Systemic, that we're collaborating with on that low emission standard to push this, as far as possible.
Got it. There was a pretty interesting decision made by Engie. I think it was last month, to not take a deal, a cargo of US LNG, or more than a cargo, to not be part of a deal with the US LNG producer because of US methane leakage. Has that spurred the industry at all? Have you seen any people more interested in your tool because of the Engie situation?
I might lean on my co-manager, Chatu, that I know is on the line as well, who I think wrote a blog kind of responding to the Engie situation. But I myself haven't had any inbounds specifically because of Engie, but I think it is something the industry is very aware of and starting to get more worried about if they can't sell their product simply because of concerns about their, emissions.
Got it. Well, Chatu has just turned on her camera, so let's go to her and see what she has to say about this.
Yeah, thanks, Randy. I think with the Engie announcement, we can't, ignore some of the other pricing and geopolitical instances that may have happened in the deal. But what we have been seeing, especially given the announcement with the EU deal and the methane policy, a lot of border tax and import regulations that might come in. So there's, I wouldn't say major, flooding of coming over to the CAE or the standard, but there has been, okay, what metrics are out there that we can prove that our gas is better, let's say countrywide, statewide, or just competitor-wide, especially in the LNG market. So people have been coming towards more in the metric space and trying to then, differentiate based on that data, which the CAE can help with.
That's fascinating. When you bring this to a global, make it a global platform, I assume that then you will be able to compare gas coming from different sources, say US gas versus gas from Russia versus gas from Australia versus gas from Qatar. Is that the plan?
Yep, we've had a lot of interest from industry and a benchmarking ability. So being able to benchmark, both on let's call it the basin level, the company level, and the country level.
Mm-hmm. And where do you see the policy environment going? Will it be more at the country level, so all U.S. gas gets sort of put together, or will it be at the basin level, or do you think even company level?
Personally, we think it's going to be more at the basin level because it matters so much what basin you're pulling the gas out of. And it's also kind of a fractured network, right? That California is probably more likely to start implementing some sort of buyer regulation before the whole US does. The EU, as a large trading bloc, is considering, methane regulations and methane management more closely than almost anywhere else. And then some places might not consider it for quite some time.
But if you're looking at the basin level, how do you make sure to actually incentivize the range of operators in that basin? Just thinking of the data you presented earlier, you have some that have incredibly low emissions intensity, and others that are pretty high. Their gas is actually more intensive than worse than coal for climate. How do you get incentives lined up?
I misspoke there. I meant to say company on a basin level.
Okay. Got it. So you go for the company, and the basin at the same time, because you'll have those are the two key variables.
In general, yes.
Okay. We had a question about the certification program. What's the timing on that? And even more than that, how do you see that actually playing a role in sort of contract negotiations? Is it going to be more on a voluntary level, or do you actually see like the EU potentially saying it has to be certified to come into the EU?
Yeah, I can speak a little bit about that. So we're pitching this as a voluntary standard at the moment and speaking with regulatory bodies because that's sort of the way it makes sense, right? So they can pick up the entirety of the standard as it is or take key components of the standard. We're pretty open to that. The pillars and the basis that we've based the standard on, that as a timeline, we've been going through reviews. So that's, going through the NGO community, many of the major producers as well as utilities, talking about that process. And we're at the stage now where we have an onshore standard and a certification process, which we're also hoping to run a pilot. So the next 6 months or so, we're looking at, volunteers in terms of producers and buyers to actually test this thing on the ground, see, the logistics of it and see if that works, as well as the, the certificate, the registry, and all of those sort of administrative blocks of the standard working. So we're hoping for a formal release next year after the pilot.
Fascinating. That's fantastic. Okay, we're going to take one more question from the audience, and then it's about time to wrap up. And it's a question about EDF and their methane sat data. Are you speaking with them about incorporating their data into the platform? And when do you think that will start to come available?
I mean, we've been in regular communication with the EDF. We have a lot of respect for the work that they're doing, and it's very much, kind of complementary to the work we're doing. We don't have a formal plan to, bring their data in because I think the satellite is at least 2 years away from launching, though I will not claim to be an expert, so please don't go and say that, I was wrong, because I'm sure I am. But yes, when that data is available, we'd love to bring it into the platform.
Got it. Thank you very much, TJ. A real pleasure. And Chathu, thank you for joining us. That was a wonderful surprise. But really appreciated bringing in your perspective as well. Thank you to everyone in the audience for being here today. We really appreciate you continuing to join Innovation Stream and continuing to ask questions. You can connect with TJ on LinkedIn and at the Rocky Mountain Institute on Twitter at Rocky Mountain Institute, MTNINST. This is a really busy week for the Global Energy Center, so we hope you'll also join us for 2 events on Friday. One on can we avoid a carbon trade war at 8 a.m. Eastern. And then the second event also on Friday is Salute to Service, Veteran Perspectives on Clean Energy and National Security. That one's at 10 a.m. Eastern. Both of those are on Friday. You can find out more about these 2 events at the Atlantic Council website. There's not going to be an episode of Innovation Stream next week because it is Thanksgiving week for us in the United States. But we have exciting programming planned for December, so please stay tuned for future episodes. Thank you to everyone who put this event together, including Iveta Kruma, Jackson Styron, Emma Smith, and Olga Kokova. This presentation will be available on the Atlantic Council website, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, so please do share it with your colleagues. Thank you again, TJ, for joining us. And thank you everyone out in the audience. Really appreciate all the time you spend with the Atlanta Council.
Randy, thank you so much.